Hello everyone, thank you for coming. My name is Eric Reichborn. I'm a researcher here at NUPI in the Security Defense Group, and today we're very delighted to have Martin Libicki here. He's the Kaiser Chair of Cybersecurity Studies at at the US Naval College. He's, among other things, of course, written a lot about cybersecurity, but also interested in technologies and national security issues. He has been writing about these issues for many, many years. From the 90s, he was interested in information warfare and how that would change the future of war. And without further ado, I think I'll leave it to Martin here. I just have to inform you that the exits are here, toilets are behind here, and the seminar will be streamed. So if you found it interesting, something you missed, you can go back and watch it later on. But here we are. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow. Can I just move this a little bit? Still too loud? For you. Let me start off with a caveat. An employee of the U.S. government. I work at the U.S. Naval Academy, but my opinions are my own opinions, which if they're shared by anybody else is totally coincidence and not really meant to represent any person living or dead. And also before I want to start, I think most of you are Norwegian, right? I want you to know that Norway this year is very popular in the United States. One of our presidential candidates learned Norwegian so he could read one of your noir novels. And as you may also know, our president has expressed the view, perhaps the hope, that all of our future immigrants can come from Norway. At which rate we could probably empty out your country in about 4 years. Make of it what you will. Okay, let me get one other thing I want to say before I start. I got to talk. It starts from here. It goes through a few pages. I am not committed to actually getting to the end, and I'm definitely not committed to getting to the end without interruption, right? You folks who want to raise questions, raise all the questions you want. It's sort of like my class. The more time they spend talking, the less time I have to spend talking, right? We only make it up at the end of the year when I give out grades. Okay, so what do I want to do today? I want to talk today about cyber conflict from sort of first principles. Those of you who are very familiar with cyber conflict from first principles, I hope you don't find it too boring. I mean, there's the old expression of somebody who was dismissed from the academia because those things, because what was novel wasn't right and what was right wasn't novel. Okay, so I will just start on that and we'll see how far it takes us. One of the reasons I'm doing it is there is a tendency for people to believe that cyberspace is the fifth domain of conflict. That it's just like all the other ones, only slightly different. Just like air conflict is just like ground conflict, only it takes place in the air, right? So you have all the military lessons, all the national security lessons you get from ground warfare, from sea warfare, from air warfare, from space warfare, so far fortunately a notional form of warfare. Clearly they're going to apply to cyber warfare, right? And so we just take this domain and we put it in with all the other domains, with all the command and control and all the lessons and all the stories, and we just apply it to a new domain. And I'm here to say that's probably not the best way of thinking about it. Okay, so let's start off with a fairly simple one. What is conflict in cyberspace? Lesson number one. Conflict in cyberspace isn't about cyberspace. Okay? We got that one? Why? What conflict about cyberspace is, for the most part, is a question about who gets to command and control logic processors. Logic processors that tell machines what to do, to tell the things that are connected to the machines what to do. Okay? The battle, the contention, as it is, takes place on that fairly small piece of silicon, which by design is supposed to be under the command and control of the people who own and operate it. And the challenge for the offensive cyber warrior is to get that machine, that processor, to do what, and I don't want to be sexist, he wants it to do, right? And the defender wants to make sure that all the instructions carried out by the machine are the things that the defender wants it to do. Now, why is it called conflict in cyberspace? Because for the most part, empirically, cyberspace, that is the connections between machines, is the way that the bad guy or the attacker gets into the systems that are being defended. But to say that that's conflict about cyberspace, that cyberspace is therefore its own domain, is like talking about World War I, right? How did people get to the front lines in World War I? They took the train, right? So was World War I a conflict about rail space? No, right? The trains were just how they got there. Cyberspace is how people get there. Now, it isn't even about how people get there 100% of the time, because in fact it is possible to have contention over a logic processor if I have a human being with a USB drive, if I have a corrupted component, if I use radio frequency waves, and I could probably think of a few more. Now, in practice, most of the way that the attackers work is to get through a cyberspace. But nothing actually happens in cyberspace. It happens within the logic processors that are connected via cyberspace. Now, why am I going on about this? Which sounds like a very pedantic and academic argument. Okay? Well, let me try 2 sentences out on you. Sentence number 1. And again, I'm speaking from a U.S. perspective, but it doesn't really matter here. The United States must protect U.S. cyberspace. Does that sound like a reasonable notion, right? Okay, you don't think it's a reasonable notion. A lot of people think it's a reasonable notion. We must protect our airspace. We must protect our coastal regions, right? We must protect our sovereign territory. Thus, we must protect U.S. cyberspace. Now, let me try a different sentence on you. The United States must protect the integrity of every logic processing device in the United States. That sounds absurd, right? Because it's not a space anymore. But in fact, when you do cybersecurity, that's what you're doing. And if you thought about cybersecurity that way, you'd say, hold it. It's not the U.S. job. It's not the job of the U.S. government to protect everybody's logic processing device, of which there are probably over 1 billion in the United States, probably another few billion in the rest of the world, right? That's the job of the people who own the logic processing device. But when you call it a domain, all of a sudden it looks like a government responsibility. And you're always fielding these questions. Well, the government defends me here in this domain. Why can't they defend me here in that domain? And because the answer is, that's not really what's going on. Okay? Fairly elementary lesson. Let me start off with a few other elementary lessons. When did the atomic age begin? Right? With Hiroshima, with Alamogordo, with the invention of an atomic weapon. Right? Most ages that can be ascribed to warfare are ages that start with the development of a particular weapon. When did the gunpowder age begin? You didn't have a gunpowder age until somebody figured out what gunpowder was and how to use it. You didn't have a battleship age until somebody built a battleship, right? What started the age of cyber war? The development of computers. Not the development of computer weapons, because as soon as there were computers, there were people trying to figure out how to make computers misbehave. This, in cyberspace, and I hate to use a metaphor, but we all know what it means, so I'll use it anyway, is the domain in which the characteristics of the defender are as or more important than the characteristics of the attacker. Let me give you another analogy, okay? Let us say that you're a defender of a country and you see a flock of enemy aircraft come in, or you see a bunch of tanks maneuvering in your direction, or you see a number of hostile ships, right? Do you have to know very much about what these planes, tanks, ships are trying to attack in order to defeat them? No. You go out there and you would try, and you basically beat up on the other guy's military. In fact, the farther from home you can do it, the less you know about what they're attacking, probably the better. Can you do the same in cyberspace? Almost never. And I say almost never because there are a couple of exceptions to the rule, right? If there's a piece of malware we see at some sort of national border, it is theoretically possible to scrub the malware out. In practice, defense rarely works like that. You can't do it at a national border. Attacks that work on certain computers don't, and certain computers don't work on other computers, right? So it's the nature of bolstering the defense that allows us, and not going after the attackers so much, that allows us to form a defense in cyberspace. Again, one of the things I used to tell people for not longer than some of you have been alive, but almost as long, is that there's no such thing as forced entry in cyberspace. If somebody has gotten into your system, they have gotten into your system because there's a pathway into your system, right? Sometimes the pathways are known but not particularly well guarded. Sometimes the pathways are unknown completely. But there had to be a way in. Merely doubling my effort isn't necessarily going to get me in. There is not a resistance that I have to overcome by some sort of numerical method. Okay? In fact, if you want to think about the contest in cyberspace, it's almost always, with a couple of exceptions, a matter of guile, a matter of fooling people, rather than a matter of force, a matter of overcoming people. Now, in practice, people get into other people's systems all the time. One of the reasons they do so is because systems are complex. And being complex, it's not entirely clear where the vulnerabilities are. And so that if you take the time to look for vulnerabilities in a system, you'll probably find your chances of finding a usable vulnerability are greater than if you don't. But ultimately, it's the owners of the system have control over pretty much everything that it takes to keep people out of their systems. Okay? Practical basis, it's a bit more complicated than that. Okay, so why do we have cyber war? Why do militaries worry about it? For a fairly obvious reason. We have become increasingly computerized. And because we're computerized, we start depending on our systems. Things that we used to do manually, we now do using computers, and we now do using networked computers to a large extent. For instance, electricity generation. Electricity generation dates back to the late 19th century. We know how to do it before there were computers. We know how to do it certainly before there was the internet, right? So you can have a full-fledged cyber war and in theory not worry about your electrical grid. But in practice, we don't know how to do it without computers anymore. And we have a tendency to network these computers together that didn't exist previously. So all of a sudden, one of the things people worry about is that hackers will get into somebody's electrical grid as part of a conflict, and by getting into the electrical grid, they will cause havoc of the sort they couldn't have done 60 years ago. Not because their weapons are better than they were 60 years ago, but because we have an attack surface, as they call it in the profession, that didn't exist 60 years ago. Okay? Couple corollaries with that. People have a great deal of control over what they allow their attack surface to look like. So, do power companies have the ability to limit their internet connections with the rest of the world? Yes. So why do we have connections? Because in a peacetime mode, it's much more cost effective. And anytime we make a connection to the rest of the world, we're making a trade-off between our ability to produce electricity or anything else cheaply, efficiently, on demand, responsively, and the risk that somebody will take a look at our efficiencies and leverage that to do us harm. Okay, but in practice, there are all sorts of trade-offs you can make, and the trade-offs are sometimes worth making depending on which country you are, what the level of threat is, what the capabilities are of those people that can pose a threat against you. Okay? So that's sort of the broad issue here. In the military context, C4ISR is becoming a growing factor in the efficacy of militaries. Not so much command and control, which was a historic way of dealing with militaries, but in terms of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Okay? Part of what computers allow us to do is to gather a lot more information about the environment, a lot more information potentially about the other side. But in order for ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance to work, you have to have all sorts of network connections. These network connections in turn become points of vulnerability. Okay. Cyberspace operations require that there be vulnerabilities in the target system. They can be system vulnerabilities, such as weak authentication. They can be protocol vulnerabilities. You have trusted someone when it turns out that they are not trustworthy, or you've trusted a process when it turns out it's not trustworthy. And they can be software vulnerabilities. Most of what you read about these days happen to be software vulnerabilities. Okay? There's an important lesson here. And I think it's far too often overlooked. In order to put malware into a system, I need a system that's capable of changing its instructions. If you have a system that cannot change its instructions, then trivially, there is no way the attacker can put instructions into your system. Right? And in fact, you can have the most complex computer, but as long as the instructions for the computer are not changeable, they cannot be changed. Now, I've been told by actually somebody who worked with Microsoft that at the time he spoke, may be largely true now, 90% of everybody who works with computers could use a computer where all the necessary material had been burned in to the computer itself. The operating system, the web browser, office automation system, okay? Such that when you turned your computer on and you turned your computer off, what was in your computer, with the possible exception of configuration files, would be the same stuff, the same set of instructions that you brought home from the factory. It's not hard. We could do that. Are we going to? Can you buy one of those computers? Not so easily. The closest you can come is an iOS machine, an Apple iOS machine, because Apple has ways of ensuring that programs cannot be changed unless Apple gives it say-so. Okay, now it turns out there are weaknesses. If anybody has a question, we can talk about some pros and cons. But what this architectural feature has done has made the iOS operating system considerably harder than the PC operating system, right? So, is a PC with built-in hardware, basically a fixed instruction set, necessarily going to be totally secure? Lesson one, nothing is totally secure. Okay, that's just a hobgoblin. That's not the standard by which we measure it. Okay, number two, it can get infected while running. But again, if you turn it on and you turn it off, it probably won't be infected at that point. There are a couple of other ways you can infect things through infected files that you keep going back to. But with that exception, you have a computer. But that computer wouldn't necessarily be all that useful. For instance, on my personal computer at home, I play video games. Not shoot 'em ups. I don't have the reflexes for that anymore. Okay? But on the system that I talked about, I couldn't install these in my computer. On the other hand, I don't have a whole lot of sensitive stuff on my computer. People ask me whether I bank I bank over the internet, and I say, when I can get my computer to spit out $20 bills, I'll start banking over the internet. Until then, some physical things that I do from time to time. Okay. A successful cyberspace operation generally requires the attacker to know something about the defender's system that the defender either doesn't know or isn't sufficiently sensitive to. Okay? In other words, I have to know vulnerabilities that you don't know about. Now, when I started in this field and I imagined that cyber attacks had powerful consequences, I would believe that people basically, when they were informed about vulnerabilities, fixed them right away. And it is true, for instance, that if you're a personal computer user and there are vulnerabilities in your operating system, Microsoft does a fairly good job of fixing them. But if you're a corporate user, you have to put in a lot of the fixes yourself. We have a city not far from where I lived called Baltimore, right? Somebody got into Baltimore using a piece of malware that exploited a vulnerability that is 2 years old. In other words, a patch has existed for the vulnerability for 2 years, right? They never installed the patch. They lost a large percentage of their government function. And oh, by the way, just to show you how clever these guys are, they never backed up any of their files. So they're in a great deal of trouble. So people are sometimes less capable in the cyber realm than I give them credit for, but that's the basic rule, okay? Generally speaking, sufficiently clever attacks are based on vulnerabilities that once a fix exists for them, and fixes tend to come relatively quickly after these vulnerabilities have been exposed, leaves you in a world and leaves you much more protected than before. Okay, and let me sort of make a broad statement about this. How many of you are familiar with what a Lanchester law is? Lanchester was a British airman who basically said in any contest between a whole bunch of masked shooters, the power of a military is proportional to the square of its forces. And this became one of the few laws that you could apply to the battlefield. Okay? And I've been wondering if there's any equivalent of a Lanchester law in cyberspace. It certainly wouldn't be a mass-based law, right? Because 2 pieces of malware coming at you don't necessarily have 4 times the effect of 1 piece of malware coming at you. The closest I can come is keyed on this notion of measure and countermeasure. Okay? So you're in a steady state equilibrium. That is to say, you know there are a bunch of potential vulnerabilities, you've patched the vulnerabilities, and then somebody discovers a new vulnerability, right? Somebody discovers a new vulnerability, they use it, people get wind of the fact that there's a vulnerability, the existence of the vulnerability gives rise to a fix, the fix goes into the system, and so what happens is the attacker has a temporary advantage, and depending on the nature of the attack, its severity and its target, the advantage then goes away. There's a constant contest between measure and countermeasure. And thus, if you want a cyber attack to have resonance, to do a lot of things for you, you have to time it carefully. And you have to use it against those folks who are going to be relatively slow on the uptake, as opposed to those folks who are going to be relatively quick on the uptake. Another thing you want to do from the perspective of the defender is to receive information as broadly as possible so that an attack on one victim becomes known to the universe of potential victims. Okay? And that's as close as I'm going to get to anything approaching Lanchester's laws, and don't ask me for numbers here. Okay. One of the aspects of cyberspace is a great deal of ambiguity. Okay? The attacker may not necessarily know how much damage has been done to a system through a cyber attack, but unfortunately, the defender might not necessarily know how much damage has been done to a cyber attack, right? If I want to corrupt your system, in other words, if I want to replace certain values that you have in your database with other values, is it necessarily going to be obvious that I know which ones have been corrupted? Because if I knew which ones have been corrupted, they wouldn't be corrupted for very long. The fact is that there are certain subtleties that you may not discover, and certain subtleties that they may not discover, means that to understand what a cyber attack has done, you ironically and uselessly have to have the cooperation of the attacker and the defender. Okay? Another ambiguity in cyberspace is attribution, knowing who did it. Now, this was more true 10 years ago than it is today. But a lot of the physical intuition that tells us who did it, okay, doesn't exist in the world of cyberspace. For instance, somebody shoots somebody else. Okay, how do you know that a particular person, a particular gun has done it? Well, for instance, if you use forensics, if you can recapture the bullet, you can match it to a gun. If you catch the guy who did it and he wasn't careful, he will have gunpowder residue on him, right? It's the how many of you have read Sherlock Holmes? Okay, one of the characteristics of Sherlock Holmes that always impressed me was usually in the first page of any story, somebody goes up to the Sherlock Holmes and Sherlock Holmes says, "This is what you do for a living." How does he know? Because in fact, in Victorian times, what you did for a living impressed itself on your body. It's the nature of the physical work, right? Well, in the virtual world, you don't have any of those indicators. You don't have literally the smoking gun. You don't have literally the powder burns. Okay, so for a long time, it was believed that in cyberspace, nobody knows you're a dog. Yes?
You wanted to be interrupted.
I just have been. Go on.
No, I mean, wasn't that one of the cases when they talked about this intrusion into the DNC folder during the election, that there were signs that there was the Russians who had something?
I'll get to that. Okay. Actually, I will get to that next. So, you get credit for knowing where I was going. This was largely true 10 years ago. One of the consequences was that we couldn't hit back to anybody in cyberspace because we didn't know who did it. And with the United States and others, including later private industry, has put a great deal of investment to learning the characteristics of potential attackers. And now we take a look at a characteristic and say, I think it's this group over here because this is the kind of malware they use. These are the kind of address spaces they go to. These are the social engineering tricks we use, okay? And sometimes you can sort of hop from one to the other. For instance, one of the ways that the United States concluded that it was the North Koreans that attacked Sony was because they used many of the methods that were used to attack South Korea. If you assume that the only people who have an interest in attacking South Korea are North Korea, and the methods look the same, you can thereby conclude that it was the North Koreans who did it. The other reason was we were listening to them. That was in the New York Times. Turned out to be much more reliable, okay? And a lot of the private companies basically have fingerprinted the modus operandi of these attackers. And have drawn conclusions. But even they aren't correct. When the DNC hack came out, the original belief was that the DNC had been attacked by two separate organizations. And they had been attacked as long ago as a year earlier. It turns out that that's not true. It is believed now to be just the GRU and that the attack was relatively recent. Okay? There's a paradox here. Let us say that you were going to attack somebody. Let us say that you were of the belief that other people knew your modus operandi, right? Other people knew how to fingerprint you. And so you've got a choice. You could go develop a whole new set of techniques, which is not easy or cheap, or you could take the risk that you're being identified, right? Let us say that the consequences of being identified is you get bragging rights. How much effort are you going to put into developing a whole new set of techniques? Not much, right? What if the consequences were that if you attacked someone, they would attack you back? How much effort are you going to put into developing new techniques? Probably a lot more, right? So, this is the way we believe. We believe that the attribution problem has been solved for deterrence, but we live in a world in which we haven't hit people back. So, of course, they've been solved for deterrence because the consequences of being caught are trivial. In a world in which we actually use the in which we actually used attribution to extract penalties from the other side, is a world in which people would make different trade-offs, which would make our attribution more difficult. Okay? So many people in the United States talk about deterrence. Attribution is certainly a barrier to deterrence, but so is establishing thresholds. In other words, what constitutes something that's actionable, and credibility. After the 2014 Sony attack, President Obama said we're going to hit back. Some of it you're going to see, and some of it you're not going to see. Okay, what did we see? Nothing, right? That says something about your credibility. Okay, what did President Obama do for the DNC attack? Right? We tossed Russians out of, we told Russian diplomats to go home. What did they do as a result of our telling Russian diplomats to go home? They sent American diplomats home, right? So were they deterred? The next time they're going to do it, they're going to say, "Oh my God, if we do this, they're going to send our diplomats home." I doubt it, right? But now let's look at it from the other point of view. One of the reasons we haven't done much about cyber attacks is because we're dealing with countries for whom we have larger issues, right? So, consider North Korea. North Korea has a nuclear program that we'd like them to slow down, reverse, stop, reverse, something like that. Okay? North Korea also carries out cyber attacks. So, if I'm going to retaliate against, if I'm the United States and I'm going to retaliate against North Korea for a cyber attack, what impact is that going to have on our ability to persuade North Korea not to own or use nuclear weapons? Will it just irritate them so that they act worse? Will it scare them so that they act better, right? Why? Because, you have to excuse me, but I'm an economist, I always think in terms of numbers. Nuclear war is in the trillion-dollar category, or the trillions of dollars category. The cyber attack on Sony was in the tens of millions of dollars category. Which is the itsy-bitsy tail and which is the big dog, right? Clearly, nuclear is the big dog. So if you want to do something about that itsy-bitsy tail, your first question is, how's that going to affect the big dog? And it turns out for every country, we have more important issues with that country than just cyberspace. With Russia, it's probably their threat to the rest of Europe, not least of which is Ukraine. For China, it's our overall trade relationship. For Iran, it used to be their nuclear program. It may be their nuclear program in the future. I don't want to get into that, okay? But whatever it is, there were always something more important on the table. So when you take a look at cyber in isolation, it's tough to make a case against basically kicking over the apple cart unless you are of a strong belief that it will help you in other areas. So in fact, after the 2014 Sony attack, you had the head of US Cybercom basically saying, well, if Sony can get away with it, other people can get away with it. And then you had the head of the US Pacific Command who's thinking, although not saying, what's this going to do to my Korean relationship, right? Do you react in terms of the country or do you react in terms of the medium? And that dilemma just doesn't quite go away. Okay. So those are the reasons why what seems to be simple in theory becomes more difficult. Now somebody says, well, what about nuclear deterrence? Didn't that work? To which my answer, the standard answer is, we don't know whether it worked. We just know it hasn't failed yet. Right? Okay. Smart-ass answer aside, one of the reasons that nuclear deterrence worked is because nobody wanted to question it. Nobody really wanted to see if we were serious about using nuclear weapons. And there's a school of thought that basically says that one of the reasons that World War II was not followed by another war was because the Soviet Union never really had confidence that they could do anything militarily in Europe without getting nuclear weapons back. Okay? And they didn't want to test the proposition. They didn't want to gamble on this. Because the consequences of being wrong in nuclear are huge. What are the consequences of being wrong in cyber? Not so much, right? In 25 years I've studied this topic. We have yet to see the first physical casualty from a cyber attack. We have seen billions of dollars in losses. NotPetya is clearly in the single-digit number of billions of dollars, right? And although it's the worst possible incident, there have been other incidents that have been similarly. WannaCry was fairly expensive. But no one's ever been hurt. And to basically risk somebody being hurt over something for which other people haven't been hurt is a huge step, which gets me to the issue of escalation. There are a lot of people who are of the opinion that the cyber domain, in fact, leads you to quick escalation, right? Somebody does this, you do that, and sooner or later it's cyber Armageddon or something like that. Reality would suggest otherwise. I can only name one instance in which a major cyber attack was followed by another cyber attack in terms of retaliation, and that would have been the Iranian DDoS attacks on the US banks in late 2012 as a reaction to their 2010 discovery that they had been hit by Stuxnet. In other words, 2.5 years later. You're not going to get to Armageddon very fast if every move takes you 2.5 years, right? Now, what took the Iranians so long? It turns out that in 2010, they didn't have much of a cyber organization. They actually had to build it up. Now, in a world in which most people have already built up cyber organizations, is that a problem? And the answer is, it is a problem in terms of targets. In 2011, NATO carried out actions against Gaddafi. NATO worried about air defenses that Libya had. Okay? So, good folks at Cybercom, they raise their hands and say, we will use cyber weapons to basically nullify the Libyan air threat. Okay. They never got a chance to play their game. Why? One, we had other ways of nullifying the Libyan air effect, right? We had bombs, we had electronic warfare techniques. We didn't know whether Cybercom could do the job. And furthermore, Cybercom couldn't do the job that day. It was going to take Cybercom some time to get into the command and control of the Libyan surface-to-air missiles. Why? Because until the NATO intervened in Libya, there was no good reason to believe that Libya was the kind of weapons that was the kind of foe that justified the investment to get into their surface-to-air missiles. Okay, so if you have two countries, both of them have primed attacks on the other, okay, and attacks on one target don't affect attacks on the other target, then you could probably have an exchange. But if you don't know it's going to be an enemy, you haven't scoped out the targets, or the first hit basically causes the other defenses to tighten up all of a sudden, you don't have much of a capacity for escalation. Okay? It's cyber, again, in this particular case, becomes a weapon of mass annoyance rather than a weapon of mass destruction. Okay. Okay, talked about this. Talked about that. Okay. I'm going to shift over to information warfare. So let's pause. You have a question?
Yeah, before you go on. I mean, there were some people saying when it came to this GRU attack, DNC, that was it McAfee who said, if I were going to do it, I would write the Russian code so everyone would think it was the Russians doing it.
Right.
Double blind.
Right.
It seems very easy to copy the fingerprint today and not very difficult and very cheap.
Well, a couple things. One is let's say you're the defender. Let's say I'm the attacker. I have to know all of what you know about me, right? As a defender, you may give me some hints as to what my MO looks like. But there are going to be things that you know about the MO that you're not going to tell anybody. They're going to be a deep, dark secret. I have to be able to guess them to have an MO that's going to completely fool you. And the second thing is, I think the Russians wanted to be caught, right? And in fact, a lot of Russian behavior, and I don't know how unique they are, but they're sort of on one end of the spectrum, is sort of like bragging rights, right? Look how powerful we are. That's important. That's important part of the psychological warfare. Again, if there were consequences, they might act differently. But right now, the consequences are positive, not negative. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Let me move on to information warfare. When I first got into this business, back in the 1990s, people had this wonderful notion that there was something called information warfare, which was going to dominate industrial age warfare, just as industrial age warfare had dominated agricultural age warfare, right? You go from sharp objects to gunpowder to zeros and ones, because we've gone from an agricultural society to a manufacturing society to an information processing services society, right? Well, it turns out if you think about information warfare as a way that you can affect the minds of the other side, you can affect the information they have access to, it's not just cyber that allows you to do things, but there's psychological operations, there is electronic warfare, there's the collection of and the defenses against surveillance and reconnaissance. Okay? In 1993, the president of the National Defense University actually formed a School of Information Warfare Studies, which was remains the best example of why it's not always a good idea to have an idea before it's time. Because the school closed after 2 years and everybody said, what is this? Right? But anyway, the notion that there was an integrated information warfare domain for which cyber would be part was part of the currency of thought that exists in that age. And in 1995, National Defense University published a monograph of mine entitled What is Information Warfare?, in which I basically made 2 points. The first point is that just because psychological operators are looking at television screens and cyber operators are looking at computer screens doesn't necessarily put them both in the screen business, right? That there were different training, different methods, different people, different objectives in each of them. And so what started off, at least among some communities, a unified endeavor, sort of split off into various portions. For instance, the electronic warfare folks didn't want to be under the cyber warfare folks. Why? Because until then, the electronic warfare folks had always thought of themselves as their magicians. And in fact, if you look at some of their stuff, there's always this guy with a Merlin hat, right? Nobody understood how it worked, but it seemed to work. And so they got themselves, they said, look, we're in the force protection business. We're here to keep airmen alive. Don't include us. Okay? So sooner or later, and the folks who did intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance basically said, yeah, there are techniques, operational security, deception, etc., that can evade intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, but they're historical. We're not in the contested business in the same sense, so that dropped off the map. Well, by 1999, you only had 2 people in the information warfare business. You had the hackers, and you had the psychological operators. And I remember a meeting at RAND in which a high government official had basically tried to put together a unified theory that would include both communities. And I was sitting in the back trying not to be noticed, but somebody happened to call on me, and I happened to say, what makes you think these two have anything whatsoever to do with one another? And his response was, because the Pentagon said they did, so we have to look for a theory. But sooner or later, the psychological operators became influence operations, became an acronym called MESO. I don't know really what it stands for. And in fact, after 9/11, it was like, how do we persuade people not to become jihadis? And they spent a lot of their time there. And that left the poor cyber operators facing an adversary that didn't seem to be very interesting at the time. And then, as luck would have it, the Chinese and the Russians came to the rescue of that community. The Chinese by getting into all sorts of computers for the purposes of cyber espionage, and the Russians by playing around in Estonia. And all of a sudden, cyber operations became very hot. And so the United States in 2009 formed the United States Cyberspace Command, right, which is basically the current state of play today. Well, whatever happened to that notion that information operations, in fact, wasn't a unified field? The answer is it didn't play all that well other places. In Russia, for instance, people think about information warfare as a collective identity, as a collective endeavor, but it's an endeavor driven by psychological operations, okay, for which things such as cybers, things such as electronic warfare, and the more technical aspects all feed into basically techniques of the dark arts or persuasion. China reorganized its information warriors in late 2015, and they put their space branch, their espionage branch, their attack branch, and their electronic warfare branch in what the Chinese call their strategic support force. Germany has recently developed their version of cybercom, but if you ask them what's in it, it turns out it's computers, electronic warfare, and a lot of systems administration. Okay, so the notion that cyber stands in and of itself is not necessarily practiced with anybody else. Okay, more broadly, as for instance we have gone from televisions to the internet, the possibilities of using computer manipulation in order to enhance psychological operations has become increasingly evident. Which gets us, by the way, to the point where it is possible to make sort of retail methods of persuasion. And I think most of you are probably familiar with how that works, right? Normally, if you want to do propaganda, you're not entirely certain who your audience is, right? If you use mass media, it's going to be a mass audience, and you have to find an argument that will have the positive impact you want on some of your target without having a negative impact on the rest of your target, right? But today, I can narrowcast down to one person. Companies such as Facebook, companies such as Google, but not only them, have gotten rich by knowing each of you individually and knowing that when you get online, these are the things you want to see and these are the things you don't want to see. Okay? We haven't seen that sort of narrowcasting be used for psychological operations except in the realm of politics, but there's absolutely no reason why it couldn't be. And that would suggest, in fact, that you could put together a worthwhile strategic campaign in which every individual is sort of treated differently. Now, actually, there has been precedent for this. How many of you are familiar with the book 1984? Okay? The last line of which is he loved Big Brother. But a couple pages earlier, when Big Brother's organization has Winston, basically where they want him, what is the method they use to have him betray his girlfriend? They used rats, because they had learned that that was the one thing he feared the most. Okay, so the notion of individual persuasion, negative persuasion, in fact, is an old notion. But computers have progressed a great deal since 1948. So leave it at that possibility. Okay. Let's see what other else. Oh, there's one other thing that's changed in 20 years in terms of information operations. 25 years ago, you could say that the whole purpose of information operations was to change the mind of the fellow on the other end. Okay? That's no longer as true as it would be. The key payoff for cyber operations in particular is to affect the machine and get the machine to behave differently without necessarily going through the human being. Okay? And we know, in fact, that if you can corrupt the instructions going to a machine, the machine can misbehave in ways that it destroys themselves. You're all familiar with Stuxnet? Stuxnet basically causes centrifuges to behave in a manner that led to their own self-destruction. There was no human intervention whatsoever. The mind of the other side was at least directly not part of the process. Indirectly it was, and I can get into that, but let me go on. Okay. That gets me, yes.
Yeah, I just had a question about information warfare.
Right.
Oh, sorry. Information warfare. I wondered about feedback loops and the ability of someone wants to influence a target audience to get real-time feedback on how well that campaign is performing. And do you think that's changing information warfare as well? Or is it making propaganda better in a way?
It certainly has the potential to make propaganda better, right? Because if you're dealing in a forum, you can see the answers coming back. And I think those chatbots, they're fairly primitive now. At some point, they're going to pass Turing's law, and you won't know if it's real or not real. By the way, I've heard an interesting comment on this, that one of the reasons that Turing's law is getting easier to pass is not only because computers are getting more human-like, but humans are getting more computer-like. So yeah, we're getting to the point where we're much closer to real time. As long as the real time thing looks human, okay? I mean, if a human went around and said, well, what do you think about this? And what do you think about that? Every 30 seconds, you start to wondering if you were talking to a human. So acting like a human is going to be one of the constraints of any chatbot that tries to survey. But that still gives you plenty of scope. Okay, let me express a word of skepticism in here, right? There are limits to how much I can predict your behavior by collecting information about you. Because people are opaque even to themselves. By and large, with a couple of exceptions, if I haven't decided what to do, somebody who knows everything about me isn't going to be able to predict what I can do. Again, there are some exceptions, and if I were more of a psychologist, I could run through them. Okay? Many of you are married. Many of you have wives or husbands, right? Those who are married, I suppose, would. Okay? How well do you know them? And the answer is sometimes very well. Sometimes they can surprise you, right? You can't really go along collecting much more information and still keep your marriage together about them than you already have. But there is a sort of a degree of irreducibility that exists in the medium. So a lot of things that are technologically possible might simply not pan out. Okay. We're ready for the Internet of Things? Yes.
You talked a lot about cyber hacking and such in the commercial sector.
Right.
In economic gain attacks, there is very prevalent with social engineering attacks. How does that change on this level of attacks?
Okay. I'm not entirely certain what you asked, but let me give you an answer anyway.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Social engineering is part of the hacker's toolkit. Okay. And social engineering has a number of manifestations. One manifestation is that can I persuade you to give me your credentials? Okay. It works an astonishingly high amount of time. Another is of a lesser level, can I persuade you to click on a link, right? And so if you've ever gone to a cybersecurity whatever, they'll always say that the human is the weakest link, that you social engineer the human, and everybody nods sagely. And I say, what's it that a guy by the name of Shostak from Microsoft said? If your security architecture depends on somebody not clicking a button, you've already lost, right? And look, you see behind you are primitive methods of information. They're called books. I can pick up any one of those books and I can read it without my eyes being infected. Right? Why can't I do this to the web? Why can't I read any material I want to, click on any link I want to, and my computer can't get infected? Once they can get infected, what's the point of getting somebody to click on a link? Almost nothing. Right? But if you focus on the human, you take responsibility off the engineers. Or you take responsibility off the people who basically designed the architecture, which makes the engineering work harder. Okay? I don't think there's any ipso facto reason why we couldn't have that kind of capability. And then we wouldn't worry about social engineering quite so much. Right? And as far as entering credentials are in, here's the one rule that I think, and we teach this stuff to our midshipmen at the Naval Academy. Never enter your credentials in a process that you yourself did not initiate. It's not a very complex rule, right? Once you understand what it means to initiate a process, right? It would get you out of a lot of trouble. Finally, because you've touched on something, it's a bête noire, as they say in French, okay? In the United States, 50 years ago, there was roughly 50,000 people a year killed in automobiles. Fast forward to a few years ago, before people discovered cell phones. The number of vehicle miles traveled in the United States went up. The number of automobile accidents went down. So your deaths per 100,000 miles fell by 75%. So I say, okay, why do we have traffic accidents? Because of the nut behind the wheel, right? So here's the question. Are my kids better drivers than my dad is? No, of course not. They're not 4 times better, right? Why are we safer? Our cars are safer. Our highways are safer. Our emergency medical responses are safer. Our signage is better. All those sorts of things. In other words, you can tell people to drive safely until you're, as my dad would say, blue in the face. Or you could engineer a system where bad behavior doesn't have the consequences it had, right? And in many ways, this is political. Large institutions are the ones who are responsible for the technical features of cyberspace. Individuals are the ones who are responsible for their own behavior. What happens when you point your fingers at individuals? You take responsibility from large organizations. Who is better equipped, in fact, to give you cybersecurity? Large organizations, because they can specialize in that. But how many conferences do I get to where people say, we should teach people cybersecurity in elementary school? I said, no, they're having a hard enough time doing this reading and writing and arithmetic thing, right? Build computers so you don't have to do it. Anyway, that's my point of view. Yes.
Sorry, I'm most likely I would like to ask a question with a short yes and no answer, but I will put it into a context first.
Okay.
I am a cell phone manufacturer.
Okay.
I am a PC laptop manufacturer.
Okay.
I am building a infrastructure for mobile networks, meaning designing it.
Right.
How can
You're a very versatile gentleman.
Exactly. How can you prevent me from having access to any information in your system?
How can you prevent me from having... You put up advertisements saying how much you love privacy, and that would make you Apple Corporation. Okay.
I would say rather say Huawei.
We can talk about that. Okay. How do you keep from having access to the information in your system? Okay, let's use Huawei because that's a good one, right? So Huawei builds all our infrastructure. How do they know they don't have the content? The answer is what infrastructure are they building? Okay, if they build the phones have to have access to the content. If they build the switches don't have to have access to the content, okay? So if all phones, basically, all communication devices used encryption by default, then the routers would basically be blind. Now, a certain percentage of internet traffic is encrypted by default, and a certain percentage of it isn't encrypted by default. Okay, so there are certain advantages and disadvantages here. The other part, let's talk, what the heck, let's just talk about Huawei right now. Okay, the other issue is, from the Huawei's point of view, how would I figure out what was worth taking and what was not worth taking? If you take everything back, you've just eaten up all your bandwidth, right? So you actually have to have a fairly high degree of artificial intelligence in the system, and it creates a challenge, okay? Perhaps one so daunting that that's not how you get from here to there. I don't know if some of you folks are familiar with the controversy. The New York City subway system and the Washington Metro subway system are buying rail cars from China. And a number of people in Congress have complained that these rail cars would allow the Chinese to intercept conversations on the metro. Okay, now think about that for a minute. One, you have to have a lot of well-placed microphones in the metro, because that place is noisy. And the New York subways are even noisier, right? Then you have to send all of it back, because unless you have voice recognition capabilities inherent, you have to send all of it back for analysis. Yeah. Oh, did I say something wrong? Okay. And then you have to actually have the devices which will take your communications off the subway cars in sufficiently high bandwidth. And by the time you're done, you're thinking, there's got to be an easier way to spy on people in New York City, right? You go to Huawei, don't use the rail cars. But you know what I mean. Part of what I'm basically saying is that a cyber attack that may look scary to you, from a policy, from a military point of view, you got to look at the attacker and say, what are the barriers to attacking from their point of view? And given their barriers, is it something that they would do, right? As a CISO from a New York bank once told me, and everybody else in the room, right? Hackers have bosses and budgets too. And if they don't succeed, they tend to move on. So you end up with a grizzly bear joke. I'm sure you've heard the grizzly bear joke. It's a cliche. I'm tired of the joke. But if you haven't, I'll tell you anyhow. So the two people in the woods, one of them spots a grizzly bear. Person ties his shoes. The other person says, you're not going to outrun a grizzly bear. The answer is, I don't have to outrun a grizzly bear. All I have to do is outrun you. You've heard this all before, haven't you? Yeah, okay, it's a cliche. But it's one I want to introduce, right? To a certain extent, you don't have, if you're not particularly meaningful to somebody else, all you have to do is be a relatively hard target, and the criminals will go after somebody else, okay? If you think you're important enough to be eavesdropped on, then that doesn't work. And I'm only important enough to be eavesdropped on in my fantasies I don't tell other people. You know, paranoia with delusions of grandeur.
Just to add the question, the key issue to my understanding
Yes.
is that through the knowledge of the operating system, of the hardware involved,
Right,
and controlling the infrastructure,
right,
I'm able to download system a kind of a application to your device without you knowing and without you being able to protect you from it. That's number one. Number two, no matter how complicated your encryption keys and encryption system is,
right,
as long as I have access to your device,
right.
then I have access to everything in non-encrypted state.
Of course.
Meaning, I also have access to being able to transfer that back to wherever I want.
Right.
Meaning, Huawei has that access for those individuals they want to target. Am I right or am I wrong?
Well, it depends. If you're talking about a Huawei phone, you're correct. Right. If you're talking about the switches, different issue. So it depends where they are in the particular architecture. Okay. I don't see U.S. government officials using Huawei phones anytime soon. Right. And as far as... Yeah, same thing from a laptop, same thing from everybody else, right? And some companies you sort of have to trust, right? Apple is now running advertisements about how much they value privacy. And there was a celebrated instance 3 years ago, in fact, where they had a face down with the federal government over a cell phone that was captured from a bunch of terrorists. Okay, do you believe Apple? Without answering the question, somebody wrote an article in the Washington Post a couple days ago and saying, maybe Apple is trustworthy, but let's look at all the communications that are sent from your phone at night because of the apps that Apple lets on your phone. It turns out one of the most notorious violators was Yelp. Why does Yelp need to know about my phone if they're just going to transfer, you know, restaurant ratings? I don't know. Yeah, it's a difficult It's a difficult ecology. Now, is the United States right about Huawei and 5G? That's a really complicated question. So let me try to talk about it a little bit. Yes, the potential exists. Yes, the Chinese government can tell Huawei what to do. Over time, I think the Chinese government's ability to tell Huawei what to do is likely to decline. I don't know how fast, because at some point, corporations will start having serious power in China. That point hasn't come yet. Okay? There has been some indications within the intelligence community that Huawei has done some dirty deeds, but nobody in the intelligence community wants to talk about it other than saying it's happened. And then they're shocked when people who don't get the details don't trust us that Huawei's done particular things, right? And that gets back to the attribution issue. It's one thing to say, I've got really good attribution in cyberspace. And you say, how do I know they did it? And they say, trust us, we are really good, right? For instance, getting back to the Sony case, the FBI put out a press release saying North Korea did it. The entire text that basically made the case was 140 words long, or about 3 times as much information content as a tweet, right? And you're thinking, do I trust this? Do I not trust this? And then in the New York Times, they had an article that said, oh, by the way, we were eavesdropping on these guys. Okay, that I believe. That's much better. But you have the same problem. If your attribution is good and you don't tell anybody, then you're forcing a lot of people to trust you. And some people will and some people won't. And when there's money on the table, they have a great incentive not to trust you. Okay? So the question is, how serious are we? Are we going to break sources and methods for this? Do we think it's going to be persuasive? And that's a question, right? The Chinese see it as a pure trade deal. They're not entirely wrong, because we keep saying, well, we don't want Huawei to dominate 5G. Why? So we can have Americans sell 5G? Americans don't sell 5G equipment anyhow. It's Ericsson and Nokia. I just work here. Any other questions? Yes. Hold on. The magic microphone has to come over.
People are talking about the quantum computing arms race and the impact this may have. Have you thought about this? Does it, if you're thinking about what's around the corner on the horizon, do you think it may change your opinion of cybers or cyberspace and cyber operations, cyber war, when a nation, whether it's an adversary or an ally, has this capability?
Short answer to your question, yes and no. Okay, now let me get a longer answer to your question. In 1995, I hung around DARPA. And this was a year after Shor's algorithm, the one that basically said that if you had a quantum computer, you could break prime numbers. The NSA at the time, and I say at the time because it was sort of like a window into something, basically said, we really want to know how to make a quantum computer. They said, our problem is 3 times 5 equals 15, and we want to be able to run it backwards. Okay? Or we want to be able to know who's going to run it backwards. At the time, I thought I was really out on a limb saying we will not get a usable Shor's algorithm for 20 years. And we wouldn't do it because there's something called error correction, which also grows exponentially as you have the number of qubits, right? And if you have 2 exponential processes, it's not quite obvious which one is going to win. Well, here it is 24 years after that event, and my way out prediction turned out to be fairly good. Okay, we don't have quantum computers yet. That doesn't mean we'll never get them. The NSA is busy developing quantum-resistant encryption. Right? I thought at one point they thought it was going to be elliptic curve cryptography. More lately, I've heard that they don't think that's going to work either. Fair enough. I'm not a cryptographer, although the brightest people I know are. Okay? So what can I say about that? Number one, quantum theory tells us reliably that you can establish a quantum channel that cannot be eavesdropped on, because any attempt to measure something will change the polarity of the bits, and it becomes obvious. Okay, the Chinese are busy investing in that. Does that mean we will no longer be able to eavesdrop on the Chinese? Of course not. That means no, because that's just one part of a multi-chain process, right? That doesn't mean that they won't have error-free computers, device-free rooms, bribe-free individuals, right? There are all sorts of ways of gathering intelligence. Just because you cannot put a physical tap on a particular wire doesn't mean that the other ones aren't available to you. Okay. The future of encryption, that's a tough one. My hunch is we will come up with quantum-resistant encryption methods. Okay? But it's just a hunch, and you don't have to believe me. Okay. In terms of quantum computing, it's actually pretty good at solving particular problems, such as understanding, say, protein folding or something else like that. But in the end, quantum computers are good at understanding quantum computers. So that's self-licking ice cream cone to it. Okay, so unless I miss my guess, the quantum revolution isn't much of a revolution at this point. Okay, and it will not be true that he who controls quantum controls the universe. As we all know from reading Dick Tracy, that was magnetism. No Dick Tracy fans here? God, I am showing my age so much more often. Any other questions? And the magic microphone?
Can you elaborate a little on what you said about cyber attacks being more about controlling systems and machines rather than humans?
Okay. At the risk of repetition, let me try this again. Okay. You're a person. You control a piece of weaponry. I influence you through a cyber attack. Maybe I give you a false command that a false email that says your commander has told you not to do something. Maybe I have blocked one channel of using electronic warfare and using another channel. Okay. Maybe I've sent you other messages that convince you that it would not be right for you to fire your weapons, right? But in the end of the day, it's your mind I have to influence, and you're the one with your finger, literally finger on the trigger, right? Now computerize the weapons. The weapon can be controlled by any number of, it can be controlled autonomously. Let's make it a little harder. But in fact, the code is open because the weapon is also computing to a whole bunch of other folks. So I generate something that overcomes authentication, puts some malware in the system, and all of a sudden the computer that controls the weapon, rather than your finger, is doing something that I wanted to do because I've controlled your computer. And so in this particular case, the head isn't there anymore. Now, it turns out, fortunately, that militaries are relatively slow to get into this because you're dealing with lethal weapons. You want a man in the loop, right? But slowly but surely, we are getting to a point where machines are starting to make their own decisions. Now, a lot of people get into a moral twist over this. Okay? So, here's the question. Would you rather have a dumb artillery round that could hit any one of a number of people because you can't aim it very well, or a smart artillery round that's autonomous? Well, in terms of your collateral damage, you're almost always better off with the latter. Now, if there's an intermediate state, which is a precision weapon under human control, that might be best. But you don't always get to choose the best. You see what I mean? So everything becomes relative. And incidentally, at least as far as the United States is concerned, we are a lot more careful about collateral damage than we were in the Vietnam period and the Korean period. In the Korean period, we couldn't aim at anything. So it was like, it's all bonus. Sure, we're flattening some cities. That's part of our strategy. Then in the Vietnam period, we said, maybe not so fast. And now it's unthinkable until somebody hurts us really bad, in which case, forget about it. But that's the human condition. Okay, any other? Yes.
Thank you, Martin. Let me try to challenge you on the analogy with the railroads, that the cyberspace is not really where things are going on.
Right.
Where it's in the computers on the other end. We have a project here at NUPI that we're actually looking at rerouting of traffic, for instance, or weaknesses in exchange points, or even eavesdropping by bending fiber optic cables In other words, there are security issues in the transportation line, if you like, it's you know, as well. I'm not saying it's necessarily the most important one, but it's certainly an aspect also in terms of cybersecurity that has to be taken into consideration, isn't it?
Every wonderful generation has an generalization has an exception. Okay, it is actually possible, I am told, I'm not an electrical engineer, to be able to induce signals on a wire through induction. I don't know how you do the same thing on fiber optics, but if you tell me it can be done, I'll take your word for it. But this is such a small percentage of what goes on in cyberspace that I still think I have a few more audiences left I can tell my story to.
But I mean, routing traffic, where it's going.
Yeah.
We're not on the physical layer, to use your own terminology, but we are. But still, it is where it's going, to which exchange points. That matters quite a lot, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, that matters quite a lot. But who makes the decision? The router. The router is using digital processing logic, right? Again, it's at the nodes, not the links. Okay. Further questions? A further question. Boy, that makes my life easier. That's what I tell my students. Go on. Yes, your microphone isn't working very well.
Hello? Oh, hi. Yeah, we have an election here in Norway in a few months, and a campaign going on. So I was wondering, it's a very big and principal question, but from an outside perspective, how do you see the potential revenues for trying to influence a democratic election in Norway? And is that something we should be concerned about? Obviously, I think about affecting information and using cyber defense tools.
Well, my rule of thumb is you should always be concerned about everything, because then it won't happen. It's the things you don't worry about that come and bite you in the rear end. Okay, let me give you a more serious answer. One of the problems about understanding cyber attack, cyber warfare, etc., that has taken place as a result of 2016 is people cannot differentiate between the election system and the political process that takes place before the election system. There are parts of this information world that are clean and parts of which are dirty. And let me start off not by talking about elections, but by talking about the stock market, right? How does an analyst or a trader figure out the value of a stock? Well, there's research, there's gut feeling, there's rumor, right? There's the attempt of the people who run the market to try to influence your opinion. There's the motley fool. It's a mess. There are all sorts of various forms of information that affect the analyst's assessment of what the stock is worth. It's what I would call a very dirty information atmosphere. But when it comes time to execute a trade, we want that trade to be 100% executed, right? The recipient is the right recipient, the seller is the right seller, the price is the right price, the time is the right time. We want that to be 100%. Anything short of 100% makes us worry. So here's the question. I spread a rumor about Norsk Hydro, to use a random company that's been hit by a cyber attack recently, right? And that affects its stock price. Is that an attack on the stock market? And the answer is no. It's an attack on the stock market when you try to trade Norsk Hydro and the trades don't go through, or the price isn't what you expected. Okay, now let's get it back to politics. I'm trying to make up my mind about a presidential candidate. Or in your case, I get what, prime minister, a party, whatever, party. Okay, I am subject to all sorts of influence. Are there going to be people in the political world who lie to me? Yes, all the time. Most of them will be Norwegian. Just like most of the people in the United States who affect the American political process are Americans, right? All of a sudden you see some Russians in the business. Does that mean your democracy has been attacked? You know, it's a dirty process to begin with. Now, if the Russians were to get into the voting booth and start influencing votes, that's something very different. Okay, but that did not happen in 2016, and it didn't happen in 2018. And if it's a real problem, we know how to solve that one really quickly. It's called paper. You know, it's like electricity. We used to generate electricity before the internet. We used to vote. before there was electronics. Okay, now if you don't like that, because as it turns out in the 2000 election, hanging chads and all that sort of, sorry to be such a colonial on this, but I always assume that if I know about it, everybody knows about it. Okay, quick review. 2000 election, Bush versus Gore, comes down to the state of Florida, 500 votes, they do a recount. It turns out that not everybody pushed their circle through entirely, and so the question is, how much of a circle do you have to push through before it counts as a vote, right? Not a problem you have in the binary world. It was a problem in the analog world. Okay, so my best guess is electronic voting machine, printed record, sign off on the printed record, drop the record in a box, count the voting machine, and if you have any discrepancies, go back and count the ballots. Okay, but that's not here. The point I want to basically make is we must differentiate between the two, right? Did I like Russia meddling with our election? No. But I wouldn't have liked it if anybody had gone and started unearthing files that were supposed to be secret, because I believe that people in certain situations, most situations, should be allowed to keep secrets, right? Now, what happened in France? Something very similar, right? Except what Macron did, the French have a number of advantages having to do with how they run their elections, was basically put a lot of crap in his files, and the Russians had to wonder what's real and what's not real. Why? Because one of the characteristics of cyber, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me, right? People learn, people that have adapted. So I think the shock of what happened in 2016 has in many ways worn off. And I'd like to give it an opinion that has nothing whatsoever to do with cyber, or a little bit to do with cyber. I think the reason the DNC attack was damaging is because it associated Hillary Clinton with emails when there was a previous issue that associated Hillary Clinton with emails. And this reminded people of the previous issue, right? So it all got mixed up in their mind. But that's just my opinion. Okay, any other questions? Ah, you ask me a question? You got a microphone of your own.
Yeah, but well, there it's on.
Privilege.
I was wondering if you can say a little bit about the emergence of artificial intelligence, machine learning software, and whether that's maybe changing the playing field, defender, attacker, or how do you see that playing out?
Okay. First of all, artificial intelligence has been around the corner since the late 50s. And there's an old saying that if it works, it isn't AI. Which basically means if it works, it's an algorithm. If it's an algorithm, it's not artificial intelligence. It turns out with deep learning and neural processing, that's no longer true. Okay, so let's talk about cyber activity and artificial intelligence. Bottom line is it gets the amateurs out of the business. Okay, why do I say that? Because once you start having programs that can look at code for vulnerabilities, your programs are going to be more secure. But at the same time, if you give the program to a hacker with a machine, they're going to find vulnerabilities faster, right? It's not entirely clear who's going to find the vulnerability, whether it's going to advantage the attacker, the offense, or the defense. By the same token, for instance, if your cyber defense is based on anomaly detection, artificial intelligence will allow you to do it better. But artificial intelligence will also allow the attacker to, in fact, simulate a correct state better. But it means that if you're going to compete, you got to have access to the AI. And that tends to push amateurs out of the business. And we're already seeing amateurs come out of the business, right? I mean, it used to be, oh my God, you had to, you know, your greatest enemy were your middle school kids who were bored and decide, okay, that's not true anymore. Cyber hacking and defense have become highly professionalized. That doesn't mean there aren't some middle school kids that can surprise you. But it means that their numbers are fewer and that their impact in aggregate is much less. Okay, but there's another statement I want to make about AI, and that is AI, there's a broad principle involved in the hacker, what I would call the hacker way of war. And that is, what hackers do is a relatively small and modest effort that has relatively large consequences. Okay? A lot of military history is a search for small efforts that have large consequences. Okay? And the famous commanders, the Napoleons and the Nelsons, okay, knew how to read a battlefield and say, well, if I just do this, I will have an enormous advantage of the other guy, okay? I think of Nelson at the Battle of the Nile. I think of Napoleon at Austerlitz, okay? Commanders still have that capability. But what's happened is now the place where you can find the high leverage is shifting over to the analysis of the other guy's information systems, right? So if there are vulnerabilities in the systems, then they don't necessarily have to be software vulnerabilities. They can be vulnerabilities in the interaction of subsystems. You can poke at that vulnerability in such a way as to give you a disproportional effect. Okay, the broad issue. Okay, so what does AI have to do with it? AI, or machine learning, is being used in such things as automated vision, target detection, right? But the algorithms they use are not the same algorithms that humans use. And in fact, because of their refined nature, they're capable of being fooled in ways that humans aren't. So what artificial intelligence does from a military perspective, it expands the attack surface. And so you as the other side say, how can I manipulate the environment so that the artificial intelligence system draws conclusions from that environment that are completely wrong? Okay, now that's a problem for all artificial intelligence. But here's the big difference. Let us say I'm building a self-driving car, right? Generally speaking, I'm not putting it in a hostile environment. I'm putting it in a dangerous environment. So if I have enough instances of the car reacting to other drivers, to the weather, to circumstances, falling branches, all that sort of stuff, sooner or later it'll become quite reliable. Once you have an adversary, somebody's going to be looking at those things that you haven't tested for and start poking that at you. And for the defender, the builder of the AI system, you have to be able to imagine all the tricks that a hostile adversary would do. And by its nature, that's very difficult. So what artificial intelligence does is that it increases the value of having people who think as hackers do. Okay. Any other questions? I'm probably not going to start anything else, so you might as well ask questions for the next 4 minutes. Yes?
So, yeah. I just wondered, going back to the Huawei question, do you think the national security argument, is it really about espionage, or is it more about the role Huawei would play in a potential conflict or near conflict situation?
Obviously. No. Yeah, we've covered that. Okay. No, the question is, we have more to fear from the eavesdropping, or we have more to fear from them dropping all the circuits? And it depends where they are. Okay. If they sell us main routers, that could be a problem. Okay. But it wouldn't be a crisis. It would have to be a war. And the reason is, we trust electronic equipment from China. Right? We don't think it's hostile. And we continue to buy it. Electronic equipment is one of China's main export sectors. Anything they would do in a supply chain hack would make it very difficult for us to buy certain categories of things from China. And if those categories are defined as anything with intelligence in them, that's a growing proportion of the global market right there. You know, because as you get your Internet of Things, as things become more intelligent, right? So if in the worst case, and they're sitting on the main routers, and they decide that they're going to go home forever, then the quality of our systems are going to be proportional to the quality of people who know how to restore these things. And I'm not quite too sure how long to follow that road down there, okay? But if you're just talking 5G, which, by the way, I think is overhyped. I talked to somebody at NT&T a year ago, and I said, well, what about 5G? And he says, yeah, we'll put some in railroad stations because you have a mass of people in one place wanting to use their telephones. Other than that, we have no plans to deploy it, right? So maybe that's hyped. Okay, it's ultimately, today's environment is based on Cisco and Juniper, and probably some of the phone companies, because they're the guys who have the main switching architecture. The closer you are to the consumer, generally speaking, the more recoverable things are. I wouldn't say it wouldn't be a mess. Yeah, it would be a mess. I'm pretty certain our nuclear establishment does not rely on Huawei routers. I'm not sure they rely on routers, but that's another story. Okay. Yes.
Yes, not entirely sure about the question yet, but you touched.
Sure about the answer, so we're even.
You touched upon the cyber hype, right? And well, locating you, I would say you are much more on the moderate side, right?
Oh, I'm totally moderate.
Right.
Practically milquetoast.
I can't help myself but to think that in the public and also in certain policy circles, we still tend to listen to the more vocal hype persons.
That's true in every field. It is.
Is it?
Let's say I'm a cop and I have bust a cocaine ring, right? And they say, how much cocaine have you taken? Are you going to get the wholesale price? You're going to get what the guy paid for it? Or are you going to get the price at the retail level, which has nothing to do with the value of what they have? Which one's going to hit the newspapers? Of course it's going to be the retail level. There was an article on WannaCry that said this caused anywhere from $500 million to $5 billion worth of damage. What did the headline say? WannaCry causes $5 billion worth of damage. That's the news. That's media for you.
But it creates policy. So for instance,
it certainly influences policy.
Germany we just learned about Germany planning to create a legal framework for offensive, well, what's called hacking back, right? Active defense.
Good luck with that, guys. Yeah, go on.
I know. I mean, it's kind of an absurd idea, but still they are proceeding it.
Yeah.
So how do we get more reasonable people to talk to politicians?
Well, I'm not going to go tell the Germans not to do it, and here's why. My problem with hacking, okay, first of all, there's hacking back where you've privatized it. That clearly, which is bad news for a whole lot of reasons. That's not what you're talking about. You're talking about something closer to persistent engagement that our own cybercom is doing, right? Okay, first of all, I have no moral qualms about hacking hackers. Second of all, you happen to have chosen your hardest target. If I wanted to punish you for your cyber attack, I would not go after your hackers, because they're the guys who know the most about defense. If you remember, in Washington, there was an article right after the election that we had managed to do a DDoS attack against the Internet Research Agency, okay? But you didn't see us going against the GRU, because the Internet Research Agency was just a bunch of social media wonks, right? Not a bunch of IT wonks. So is this efficacious? So my view is it's moral, and it's probably a waste of time. But I don't know, because I don't have access to what they've done, right? I do know that people who have had access advocate for it. How much strength do I want to put on that? I don't know. You know, there is a tendency in the military domain to believe that the best counter to any weapon is the weapon itself. Right? The best counter to a tank is a tank, and that's an argument usually made by your own tank corps. The best argument against a submarine is another submarine. The best argument against a fighter aircraft is another fighter aircraft. They all have their biases. So are we shocked that Cybercom basically says the best policy to use against hacking is to hack them back? They're just being human. Right? Are they right? They happen to be right in the case of submarines. Okay, are they right in the case of hacking? I don't know. I mean, to say that someone has a tendency to do something doesn't necessarily mean they're wrong. Which is, by the way, I know almost no classified data on this stuff. which is why I can speak freely and spontaneously to all of you folks. Okay, it's 1:33. I'm going to turn it over to our moderator-in-chief.
Thank you very much, Martin. It was a pleasure having you and listening
Pleasure.
to you.
You were a kind audience.
I mean, we had a lot of questions and a lot of interesting topics that were brought up. Huawei, of course. And we talked about that earlier as well. I just want to thank Martin here, and then we can give him a hand. Thank you very much. And then stay tuned and check for more seminars here at NUPI. There will be more covering cybersecurity and also technology and future warfare as well. So please welcome back.